Welcome to episode 1 of BCBA Today. Today we're going to be talking about early signs and diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or sometimes I'll refer to it as ASD. Let's jump right in. So CDC just came out earlier this year with the new numbers. It's now 1 in 36 8-year-old children in the United States of America have been identified and diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. When I first joined the field back in 2012, the numbers were 1 in 69. So quite a big jump there, almost half what it was then. If you look back into year 2000, it was 1 in 150. So we were at less than 1% of the population at that point. Pretty drastic. We'll talk about maybe some ideas for that, but I'm going to continue to go over a couple of more statistics before we jump into that. 1 in 100 in the world, right? So still a pretty high number here in the United States of America. We'll talk about that in a second, but 1 in 100 overall in the world from the WHO. There's also in the United States, Asian, Black, and Hispanic children are now 30% higher in 2022 than they were in 2018. That's a good change to see. I know that sounds interesting for me to say that we're happy about an increase of 30% higher, but autism does not know race. It does not know economic status. I don't think it geographically has a lot of play either. I'm sure that there are some cultural variables there, as well as education and access and all of those things. But as far as what we know, it does not know boundaries, right? So autism can occur in any person, any shape, any size, any color. And so the fact that we're seeing an increase probably means that we're actually getting to those kiddos that potentially need those services. It's still 4 times more likely to be diagnosed in boys than it is in girls. I've seen that across the field. At one point, I had 4 or 5 girls on my caseload, and I was shocked. It was amazing to work with so many girls, but it does not happen often. Far fewer girls in the field, obviously, and with this statistically, that just makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about why. I have a lot of people ask me, why do you think the numbers just keep going up and up and up? I think for one, our access to diagnosing has gone up significantly since I've been in the field. When I first joined the field, kids were waiting years to get a diagnosis. There were wait lists a mile long. You'd have to drive 2 or 3 hours. And in some places in the United States, that's probably still occurring. And if you think about worldwide, obviously still occurring. But if you think about, I was in Indiana, small town Indiana, when I first joined the field. People were driving down to Indianapolis. They were driving to the southern part of the state, or even up to Chicago, places like that. So several hour trips to be able to do that, and then long wait lists. So I think just access to diagnosing is a really big factor here. I think the other part too is that there's been a really big push for educating parents on the signs and symptoms of autism so that we're able to actually diagnose these kiddos. Sadly, the pandemic affected a group of kids, and so now they're getting diagnosed later because we were not diagnosing kids for a 1 to 2 year period, and so their diagnoses came late. And so that's going to affect some of the numbers for a while now too. But overall, I think that increase mostly relies on more education, better access to things. When my brother was diagnosed, he was one of the first kids in Indiana to get a diagnosis, and my mom had to take him down to Bloomington to this special, it was like a research study basically to get him diagnosed. And that was, 40 some years ago. And then it was like, all right, best of luck to you. So just how times have changed. Let's talk a little bit more about the diagnosis itself. Like I talked about before, the wait list, 2023, I was just pulling some of these things up. I was curious to see where we were now post-COVID, catching up a little bit. Obviously, things were a little bit backlogged. 2023, it's still saying that you can wait 13 months for a diagnosis, and that in 2020, so right in the middle of COVID, right before that, right as it was, coming out, a parent was waiting 2 to 4 years from the time that they were seeing concerns for their child to actually getting a diagnosis. So you think about a parent being concerned about these things and then waiting 2 to 4 years just to get a diagnosis, and that's not even talking about potential need for treatment or supports, things like that. So a big delay there. I think the other thing that we're seeing too now is that because autism doesn't require, there's no blood test to test positive for autism. There's no MRI, CT scan, nothing like that we can do and say yes, they have autism. There's a couple of materials that we can use. There's testing that can be done. I'm an ADOS certified. I don't know if I'm certified. I probably shouldn't say that, but I've been through the training for ADOS. I've conducted ADOSs for several children. I can help in the diagnostic process for children. So I've done several of those. There's a couple different methods of doing that. And you combine all of these reports and you say, yes, it looks like they meet all the criteria based off of the diagnostics. That'll probably be part 2 of this, is actually looking at the autism diagnosis and going through those criteria together and kind of explaining that. But for now, you're just stuck with me talking about it. But one of the things I think we see often is because we can diagnose it pretty early. I've seen kids as early as 18 months getting a diagnosis of autism. They're diagnosing the child with autism because they meet a certain criteria. These criteria, while appropriate, might also be manifesting some other things that could be going on that can't be diagnosed until later on in life. That's not to say that the child is getting an autism diagnosis and they don't have autism. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they meet the set of criteria, and so they get an autism diagnosis, which means that they get access to treatment and resources immediately, which is great. But sometimes as they get a little bit older, we start to see either some comorbidities or potentially, maybe autism is not the most intrusive diagnosis for this individual. And I'm talking about, either profound autism or some other diagnoses. Sometimes I've seen where they get an autism diagnosis very young, and then as they get older, they get a bipolar diagnosis or schizophrenia, a lot of ADHD diagnoses or comorbidities, even RAD, reactive attachment disorder, for kiddos who have experienced significant trauma. And then just many other diagnoses that come out. But like, for example, bipolar, you wouldn't see a diagnosis of that likely until a child is 12 or much older than that. So it's very possible that they have autism. They certainly met the criteria for it. That's how they got the diagnosis. And so they've been potentially receiving treatment for that. But that's not to say that, as they get older, that other symptoms might come about and autism may no longer be, potentially the most significant diagnosis for this individual. So that's just something to keep in mind. They can get a diagnosis young and access to treatment, and that's great. I would love them to get the treatment that they need. So now let's talk about some early signs of autism. This is one of the ideas that was posted. I asked all my Facebook friends and my Instagram friends. I have a lot of people in the autism community that I'm acquainted with, and just asked them for some ideas. And a lot of them were saying, what are the early signs of autism? We need to talk about that. We need to continue to educate. So let's talk about those. There's 3 main areas that we're going to breach on, and I'll kind of organize them a little bit better when we talk about the specific diagnosis of autism and actually how you get that, the levels. I'll go through and explain all of those. For today, I'm just going to go through a long list. Some of these I came up with off the top of my head from being in the field for so long. Some of these I kind of wanted to see, like, what's the World Wide Web saying about the early signs of autism, and so I pulled some of those as well. Here's what I came up with. Lack of communication. This is an overly generalized statement. This can be anything from, your child's not making eye contact. They're not seeking eye contact. They're not attempting to communicate with you through normal means. They're 1 year old and they don't have any words. That's a big sign. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have autism, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. They should have at least a couple of very small words by the time that they're 1. The other thing I would say about lack of communication is sometimes they're 2 or 3, and they will have a sudden and sharp decrease in acquisition of communication. So maybe they had a bunch of words and then they're just gone. We see that not often per se, but I've seen it frequently throughout my career. Limited eye contact is another one. So I'm not saying that they necessarily avoid, although certainly it does look like some kiddos avoid eye contact. I would just say, man, all 3 of my kids are neurotypical. And I was a BCBA first. I was in the field first before I had my own children. And they were just amazing to me how quickly they developed eye contact, how quickly they were very social and babbling with me back and forth and like trying to have conversations with me back and forth. And having been a clinician in the field before I had my own children from like birth, I was amazed. I was like, oh my goodness, their social skills are just amazing. This is incredible. And then as I had a second and a third, I started to realize this is typical development. And the children that I'm working with are neurodivergent. And so they're a little bit different from that. And so the differences there again are they're not trying to make eye contact with you usually, right? Sometimes they will. It's not to say that they never will. I've had a lot of parents come in and say, I didn't think they have autism because they will make eye contact. Yeah, that's very likely that they are making it. It's just sometimes they avoid it or it's just not as often as some of our other kiddos. Another big one here is stereotypy. Now, when I say this, everybody stems. I'm currently stemming. There's something on the desk that I'm playing with. I'm fidgeting with my hands. I'm fidgeting with my feet. I'm swaying a little bit. I rock a little bit while I talk. You guys are probably super annoyed if you're just listening and you can kind of hear my voice coming in and out. We all stem. We hardly notice it usually unless someone points it out to us. Other people for sure notice our stems. You have people that twirl their hair, play with their hair, all kinds of things. It's a little bit different and usually more obvious with our kids with autism. So they will engage in hand flapping. This is where they're like folding their hands over. I remember when I was just very, very little, I remember Adam being able to, it's my brother, being able to like clap his hands without putting his hands together. So he could flap them so hard that he could make them clap. And I remember as a little girl trying to do that and be like, how are you doing that? Teach me how to do that. And I would try to imitate that. And to this day, I still cannot, but he would connect his fingers with his palm and he could flap them at a rate that they would make a clapping noise by doing that. Some other kids are able to do that. Some of them stem and hand flap in a different way. Some of them like to hand flap so that they can watch it. So it's not the movement of the hand flapping, but it's the way that they get to watch that and get that visual input. Lots of toe walking. It doesn't obviously, just because they toe walk doesn't mean they have autism. That's the same for all of these symptoms, but it's just another common coincidence or common correlation there between toe walking and autism. So you'll see these kiddos all the way up on their toes with their heels up. If you see this, I would highly recommend you talking to your pediatrician about it. I'd love to get a PT on here eventually to kind of talk about that. That'd be great. Lining up objects is one that I see a lot. So even, neurotypical children, they'll line things up, but it's not something that they do like across the board with everything. You might have a kiddo that just really likes organization and likes to do these things. So look for a whole package here or multiple signs or symptoms, but kids with autism will meticulously line things up. They will get out all the cars and they'll get down in a line and they're going to make sure that those things are perfect. And if somebody disrupts them, it's likely going to be pretty emotion evoking. They're going to be pretty upset about that usually. And they must stay that way. The things must stay lined up. So if that's something that you're seeing, maybe mention that to your pediatrician. Some of the other things you might see is lots of fascination with things that spin, wheels or fans. So I have a lot of parents that say, oh, they love to play with cars. I'm like, what are they doing with them? Oh, they're picking them up and they're spinning the wheels, and they like to watch them, and they'll watch them all different kinds of ways. And sometimes you'll see multiple things happening at once. So they're picking up the wheels and they're doing this, and then they're flapping because they're so excited that they're watching the wheels spin. I've also seen a lot of fascination for doorknobs. The reflections that come off of those, especially like metallic or metal doorknobs, they can kind of watch and see how the lights go back and see the reflections off of those. So doorknobs are another one, just doors in general, open, shut, open, shut. Um, same thing with lights, flicking them on and off. Obviously, neurotypical children are going to flip lights on and off every once in a while, and maybe they go through like a little spell of where they are interested in that, but we're really looking for multiple signs and symptoms at the same time. Rocking is a big one. Like I said, sometimes I will sway, sometimes I'll rock, especially when I had my kids, when they were babies. I would not even be holding one of them, and I'd be like rocking back and forth. You might see that with some of your kiddos. You might also see this like more intense. It's rhythmic, right? So it's like I need to be able to do this. Even in the car, they're rocking. I can always tell when Adam, my brother, is really irritated. He'll start rocking very aggressively, and that's a good sign. We need to go check in on him, see how we can help him. So rocking is another big one. Finger manipulations. Sometimes they just like to play with their fingers. They'll do different little things. Maybe they'll have a rubber band that they like to play with or things like that. But their finger manipulations might be a little bit different than what you might see from other kiddos. Pacing is a big one. Pacing back and forth in a line, or what I see with kids where this is different, but I do still see it with adults too, especially my brother, is they're pacing, but they'll have like a burst of walking or running. So it's like this rhythmic pattern, right? But at a certain, sometimes there's like this burst of like leaning forward and kind of going into it and then slowing back down, and then like another big burst and kind of coming back down. Some kids with autism engage in elopement to get to specific places or just out. Some of them will go specifically to water, which can be really scary. But sometimes this elopement is this pacing or bursting. And so they'll like run from them and then they'll stop and they'll kind of turn around and they'll run back. So elopement can sometimes look, or pacing can sometimes look like elopement or running from a designated area. Elopement is also another symptom or sign of autism. 2-year-olds will run from you in parking lots, 3-year-olds as well. But this is kind of on a different level. This is like, I need to have my hand on my child at all times. I have locks on the upper parts of my doors. I feel like I need to put a GPS bracelet on my child. That's a different level of elopement that we're talking about. Some more signs and symptoms, severe challenging behavior, or just more severe. So lots of tantrums. Maybe they're moodier, you might say, than other kiddos. So they're easily irritated or difficult to calm down, especially if you pair that with like a lack of communication. It can be very frustrating. I can't imagine when I put myself in some of these individuals' positions, these kids that only have a couple of words or maybe no words to be able to communicate their wants and needs. I would be extremely frustrated too. But that can lead to a severe challenging behavior. So if you have kids that are biting, scratching, kicking, fighting, running, hurting themselves in certain ways, banging their head, slapping themselves in the face is a big one. Things like that, I would certainly mention those to your pediatrician as well. A lack of social interest is another big one. So you'll take your kiddo to the playground, and a lot of kids are often like, who's here that I can go play with? And they're looking around and they're making best friends every single time they go to the park. Our children with autism may not be doing that. They might be throwing mulch in the air to watch it fall. They might be looking at a reflection off of a slide. They very well could be playing appropriately on the playground, but there's generally just a lack of social interest. So they're just not interested in the kids that are around them. Sometimes they are. And again, that's why it's not just one sign or one symptom. We're looking here for a couple different things. Sometimes picky eating, very picky eating. My kids are picky eaters too, but we're talking about like orange, white, yellow foods, or very, very specific foods having to be heated up or cooked in a very certain way. Yeah, so just severe picky eating could be another one. Not responding to their name. This is a big one, and it's very specific. So kiddos, babies quickly learn their name, or even the intonation in which you're saying their name. So even if they haven't quite memorized like what their name sounds like, I think they just kind of learn like, oh, she's saying that thing and she's probably talking to me. Our kiddos with autism, we've often have to specifically teach this skill for them to be able to respond to their name. So if that's something that you're seeing, that's a big red flag. I would talk to your pediatrician about that pretty quickly. If they're not pointing, again, another really specific one. This kind of goes back to it certainly goes back to kind of talking about joint attention. So again, when my kids were very little and they're babies, the joint attention, the locked eye contact, I could point to something and they would attend to what I was pointing to, and they would point to something and they'd want me to join in on that. That's called joint attention, where the two of you are kind of like locked in on something and then you're jointly attending to something else together. Kiddos with autism often struggle with this. They have a difficult time kind of following a point. They will often not point. I hear from a lot of parents that their children will pull them to things that they want. This is great. I would highly recommend reinforcing that as much as you can. That's a great form of communication, but it's often they form that skill before they form pointing, which I have always found really interesting. A lack of smiling or social smiling. So it sounds just a lack of smiling sounds sad in general. Like it just sounds like my child's not as happy. I would say sometimes children with autism are just they're excitable, but excitable in very certain ways by very certain things. I would say you're going to see more of a lack of like social smiling, and it goes back to that joint attention. So if they're not jointly attending with you with something and they're not enjoying something with you, then you see a little bit less of the social smiling kind of going on. A lack of play or sharing with others. Again, they're just kind of disinterested in other children sometimes, often. Sometimes they'll watch them, but not engage. Other times they are trying to get away from them. And even siblings, they'll potentially get aggressive with siblings, or just not be interested in playing with them. And that's something that we see quite a bit. You might also think that a child has a high pain threshold. I did a lot of research on this in my undergrad, and the research then, I haven't done a lot of recent research on this, but the research then was suggesting that they don't actually have a higher pain threshold. It's just, it seems like it, basically. So if the kiddo is falling, hitting themselves on something, and they don't react, they don't say ow or ouch, or look to you to see how you're going to respond. Again, there's that joint attention. That's another sign of autism. If you feel like, no, they'll be fine, they're tough, that toughness might actually be a symptom or a sign if it's connected with some of these other things as well. A struggle with pretending or joking. Our kids with autism are usually very literal thinkers. And so we'll specifically teach them sarcasm or kind of like figures of speech. We'll have to talk through some of those things. The way their brains work are just fascinating to me. But because of some of that, they struggle with pretending or joking, making jokes, understanding jokes. They're very black and white thinkers sometimes. And so working through some of those skills can be challenging, but really interesting as well. Lastly, this is certainly not the end of them. It's just the end of the list that I came up with for today. They're usually pretty rigid and routine based. So, and it's interesting. It's so interesting. Like I said before, I grew up in an autism household. That's all I knew. My first vacation without my brother, like away from our family, was wild to me. There were so many things that I was like, oh, we're not doing that, or we're not going to do it this way. And it was just things that we had done my entire life for Adam to help support him. And so when we didn't do those things, I didn't even realize that we were doing them or that we had started doing them to help support Adam. And so very rigid, very routine based. Yeah, I mean, just it might be like we have to take the same route to get to this place every single day, or every morning we have to go through this exact same routine, or just things like that. Very rigid, difficult to change things last minute, difficult to change things at all, um, and routine based. This is the way it's done. This is the way that we do that. And if we can't do it that way, it's gonna be really hard for everybody. So I'm going to wrap up today's discussion, but I'm just going to leave with some recommendations if you're noticing some of these signs. Again, I'm not going to talk about how to actually get an autism diagnosis today, or what that actually means. I'll save that for part 2. But what I'm going to say for recommendations for today, I would highly recommend having a milestone tracker. There's so many different apps on your phone that you can use. I did this for all 3 of my kids. Of course, they also had a VB map, which is an assessment that we use at usually for very young children, like birth to 4 years old. And so I was doing that with my kids as well. But those milestone trackers on your phone are going to pop up and say, hey, your little guy is 2 months old today. Just a milestone check-in. Those are great. It's a great way to give you things to work on with your kids at home. It's a great way to kind of reassure yourself, like, hey, am I just thinking too much into this or not? Use one of those. They're super easy. They're fun. It's a great way to check your child's progress. If they start falling behind on some of those, I would assume that they have maybe some prompts built in that if your child's missing some of those milestones, to go talk to a pediatrician. If that's not built in, that's my recommendation, is that if they start to fall behind on some milestones, go check in with your pediatrician. It very well could be, hey, my kid's an only child. They're at home with me all day. They're not around other children. And so maybe they just are not absorbing some of these things. And so they're developing a little bit more differently than a typically developing child. That could be the case. Or it could be autism, or it could be something else. So just keep that communication and those concerns open with your pediatrician. The other thing I would say is, if you're starting to wonder, are these signs and symptoms autism? Am I just a first-time mom who's really anxious about everything? Been there, done that. No judgment at all from me. Or maybe it's your second or third kiddo and you're like, man, I don't know. I don't know if I'm concerned, or if I should be concerned. I would reach out, see if you have a family friend who's a teacher, or a preschool teacher, or maybe they're in the ABA field. They're obviously not going to be able to say, like, oh, I definitely think your child has autism or something like that. They're not diagnosticians, but I would just get a trusted opinion from somebody who will tell you truthfully if they think that you should be concerned. And if they say, probably wouldn't hurt to go talk to your pediatrician, then go do that. The other thing I would say is, you could talk to another mom that has, if you know of a mom that has several children or more than a couple, and that they have a child with autism, they're going to be your experts too, right? Because they've raised several kids, they've watched several kids develop, and they know the one. They know the one that has the autism diagnosis. And so I would talk to them too about what they started to notice, and maybe when they started to be concerned. I would also just say, you're going to have to be an advocate. If your child does have autism, you're their greatest ally. You're their biggest advocate. If you're concerned, stay on it. If you feel like your pediatrician is not hearing you, go to a different pediatrician. If you feel like, man, I just really feel like I need a diagnosis, or at least a diagnostic evaluation for this, to make sure that my kiddo is taken care of. Now, obviously, if you've been to several pediatricians and they're all saying the same thing, it's likely not a major concern. But if you feel like, man, something is just not right, be an advocate for your kiddo. Stay on top of it. Reach out to, again, more people. Ask for their recommendations. There's lots of communities out there. There's lots of Facebook groups for children, for parents who are parents of children with autism. Join those groups. Ask them what they would do. See what they would do in your shoes. But just try to surround yourself with a big community to help out. And then I would also say too, that if you are not getting anywhere with like an ASD diagnosis, see if your child might qualify for like some early steps or speech therapy or things like that, if they're kind of falling behind on some of those other milestones. That might be just another way to get another professional involved and get more eyes on the kiddo. They may not have autism. They might just be, have a little bit of a speech delay or something, or a developmental delay, and those extra supports will be everything that they need. Well, today we've covered quite a bit, but I'm going to go ahead and stop us there. My next episode will be about how to actually get a diagnosis, what to expect kind of from your diagnostic evaluation, what an autism diagnosis kind of means. And I hope that you all join me then. I also hope that this was helpful. If you have feedback for me, please send it to me. If you have additional questions, again, let me know. Happy to address them. And of course, I just hope this was helpful. Thanks so much.